Welcome to today's EDUCAUSE webinar, How to Become a Data-Empowered Institution, as part of our four-part webinar series on transforming leadership. And the title of that is Navigating Risks, Accessibility, and Strategic Insights. My name is Jason Martin. I'm an online event production manager at EDUCAUSE, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. EDUCAUSE is pleased to welcome our panelists, and they'll introduce themselves in just a moment, but I want to give you a brief orientation on our session's learning environment. We hope you'll join us in making the session interactive. To do so, please open the chat by clicking on the chat icon at the bottom of the presentation. You can use the chat throughout the webinar to make comments, share resources, and to pose questions for our presenters. When you do so, please be sure to select everyone from the chat dropdown so that you can engage with all attendees. We will hold a Q&A at the end of our presentation, but we encourage you to type your questions into the chat throughout. And if you have any technical issues, you can send a message to me by selecting panelists in the chat dropdown. The session recording and slides will also be archived later today on the EDUCAUSE website. Finally, the content for this webinar was developed by Vantage Technology Consulting Group, an EDUCAUSE strategic partner. EDUCAUSE is working closely with Vantage this year to strengthen the collaboration between private industry and higher education institutions and to evolve with higher education in the technology market. Please be on the lookout for other opportunities to connect with Vantage throughout the year. And with that, thank you for joining us, and I'll hand things over to you, Kirk and Susan.
All right. Thank you, Jason. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the nice, warm intro. I am Kirk Kelly. I'm a vice president here at Vantage Technology Consulting Group. I spent 35 years in higher education IT in a number of roles. Did a number of things data related, especially at my last institution. I was at Portland State University. And we're very excited for the panel here today. I'm going to turn it over to Susan, and we'll take it from there.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan Featherston, Senior Strategic Consultant at Vantage. I've spent most of my career on campuses, first in academic public health research, and then in various roles in IT, with the majority of those being in data management and IT leadership. So we're really excited to speak with Jill and Christy today, and as they introduce themselves, we've asked them to share their go-to analogy for data governance and how data literacy fits into that analogy. So Christy, do you want to go first?
Thank you, Susan. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Christy Wentz. I'm at Hamilton College, and I work in the data governance as well as business intelligence analyst. And I would say our analogy would be more like thinking about the data campus dining hall. So you have multiple stations, and each of those stations we would look at as data domains for us. So we have institutional research, we have the registrar's office, we have the library technology, we have admissions, and each one of those stations offers a specific item. So in our dining campus, we would have pizza, we would have salad. So that kind of like breaks that down to each domain being a separate entity from the other, allowing you to choose what do you need on your plate to make your meal. And that meal is going to fuel you, or more like we are going to use that meal to empower you to make decisions using data as evidence and supporting the decisions that you're making at the institution that you're currently working at. So I'll pass it over to Jill.
Thanks, Christy. Hi, I'm Jill Jemison. I am the Associate Dean and CIO at the UNC School of Medicine. I think I'll go with the analogy that data governance is really like city planning or town zoning. You and your two neighbors can do well figuring out how to mow your lawns and clear your driveways. But as we scale up and there are more differing goals, there are differing opinions, it's important to have some framework for why we have streetlights one place, why we run school buses somewhere else. And so as organizations get larger, as data gets bigger, having a framework where we understand the rules about who decides in a representative way, about what are the salient reasons for why we collect data or why we decide to put in a new bus route, is really important. I think that it's a community, individuals to communities to a framework of how we all work together and grow out for the common good.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Christy. Again, we're excited for our time here together today. And so as we were working on this webinar series, we were thinking about what would be appropriate, what's timely in this discussion. And we thought a lot about the upcoming enrollment cliff, 2026, which we were all planning for as institutions, and some institutions across the country were starting to see kind of early signs of that coming, and soft enrollments and difficulty in our enrollment funnel. And then that's been exacerbated. I don't need to give a lot of details, but I think since January, there's been a lot of curveballs thrown into our institutions, which really has driven, and we're hearing a lot across the space, conversations about data, more data-informed decision making. How can we get access to more data? How in these tight times in this ever-changing world can data play a part? And data literacy is more important than ever. So we thought this would be a really appropriate topic to bring to the group today. And again, Jill and Christy, you each have your own and unique perspectives on this, and so we're excited for our time. And so, the first question to tee up here, I think you can all, we can all identify with this unique environments that we have. Could you share a bit about how you're managing through what has been, I think, a multi-year complexity building up, and one that's been even more exacerbated in the last few months? We can start with either one of you. Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to jump in, Christy.
Okay.
So enormous complexity, and just on the heels of what we all went through with COVID, I think that the enrollment cliff hits us very differently at a medical school. We have about 155 medical schools in the country. We don't see that same cliff. What we see is a change in our students. So we are having to look much more along the continuum of education. We need many, many more data points about who is coming into our class in the most broad sense, what their preparation for education is. We cast the net very wide. We want to place doctors in rural North Carolina. We serve the North Carolinians broadly. Academic medicine serves the people of the country. We want to make doctors to fill roles throughout our country, and identifying not so much winnowing students coming into our programs, but helping craft programs that actually help our students succeed and move into residency along the continuum. So enormously important. And obviously, as we think about the change in how data is used around admissions processes and around advancement, it's challenged us to say, how do we think differently about demographic data? How do we give the data that's appropriate and mission driven, and without necessarily relying on what we always have. We have to be nimble. We have to think differently about data, and we have to be exceedingly responsive to our organizations from a legal, regulatory, and mission sense.
Christy, what are your
So
thoughts?
Hamilton looks at data as more of like a shared responsibility. We don't treat it just like an asset, because it is our asset, but it has to be a responsibility that is shared across our entire community. We want to foster a culture that is informed decision making. We want to ground that in transparency, equity, as well as accountability. And we build that trust through this transparency, right? Through data governance efforts. We're focusing on student-centered and mission-aligned data use so that we have clarity around our sources. We have role of human judgment, right? It doesn't matter that everything is coming into the technology part of it. We still require that judgment of humans in our decisions, and the data is our evidence to support those decisions. We're emphasizing to have inclusive, value-driven data practices. We want to promote access, equity, as well as student success. We want to ensure that our data users, our data is serving the right people, right? Not just the systems. And then we also are using ethical and inclusive governance so we can address bias in algorithms. We can understand and address the impact that AI has. We can look at the misuse of data. We can do this through embedding equity and ethics. We look for stakeholder input into our structures and our policies. And we also try to prioritize that cross-functional collaboration. We look at phased implementation, and that is all based on whether or not we're ready. Do we have the right training? And so that all of this can be used to build our data literacy across our institution.
So you mentioned a little bit about mission and strategy, and we've seen, and I've seen on campuses, sometimes we get mired as data analysts. We are detail-oriented individuals, and we sometimes can get mired in the details, the hazards, the benefits of whatever piece of governance that we're moving into. And I'm curious, can you speak a bit more about aligning your data governance and literacy efforts, your strategy there, with your institutional strategy, and what steps you've been taking to establish and maintain agility so that you can continue to make progress, even though sometimes we might get a little sidestepped or weaved to the left?
Well, so an agile data governance isn't just about having speed and flexibility. I think we see that a lot in the corporate world. But within higher education, this is about responsiveness. It's about iteration. It's about collaboration, all in that face of constant change. For us to be able to adapt to that fluctuating landscape, Hamilton is taking several intentional steps so that we can maintain and establish data governance through a mission-driven alignment. We're looking at institutional integration, culture, as well as capacity building. We have centralized tools and knowledge. We have a formalized governance structure, and we also have continuous evaluation, and we're also adapting when we need to through all of this. Our efforts are grounded in our institutional mission and our vision, and we tie this to our data initiatives through our institutional goals and values so that we can stay relevant, we can prioritize even as our organization evolves. We are really trying to foster that data literate culture, and we do this through training and education, as well as communication. One of the things I'm currently working on is how to communicate even more so that that brings in more awareness, and so that we can ensure our governance is collaborative and sustainable throughout every department on campus. And we've also invested in bringing in that centralized knowledge and creating like self-service access to our data, just to be more empowered to use our data.
I think it's wonderful being on this panel with Christy. Hamilton's an example of a highly mature, highly centralized institution at UNC, and I'll speak specifically here at the School of Medicine. It's been a highly distributed, highly functional, highly successful school. And I think many large academic medical centers and medical schools have this because you have distributed departments. And I liken a lot of what we're trying to do here is we think of our data in many ways internally as sort of pointillism, and as you're trying to make a more and more detailed picture, and that's what leadership is pointing us toward, it's great that we have pointillism, but to get to that, we really need people to kind of see what we're painting. So abstract pointillism isn't working so well for us anymore. And what we're trying to do is leverage the excellence that we have had historically, and to bring that into some common definitional frameworks, common data streams. The tools and the platforms we have historically have been heavily manually influenced, and so much of this is getting the right data to the right people at the right time and making that argument for the common good in service to a mission. And in some ways, to what Kirk said, is the pressures that are on the institution right now. We always liken ourselves to a three-legged stool. We have clinical, we have research, and we have education. All those legs are getting cut or changed a little bit now. So having more accurate, more current, more contextualized data is absolutely vital for us to serve what our leadership wants. And so the governance is coming over that mission. The mission wants to be able to continue to be successful for our scientists, for our students, and for our patients. So now we are answering that call, and then the data governance flows from there.
Thank you, Jill. And you hit on something we were really excited about when we put this panel together, because you're both such different environments, still trying to answer common questions, but coming at it from different approaches. And so how do you think, for each of you, how do you think your level of maturity, everybody kind of has their gauge of level of maturity in their organization. Do you feel like you're geared up and able to respond to the things that are kind of quickly coming at all of us now?
Well, I would say we talked a lot about maturity as we were preparing for this.
Yeah.
it depends on what you're looking at. We have great deep pools of data maturity. What we don't have is that sort of overarching data maturity as an organization. So I think that this goes back to, I keep talking in analogies, it goes back to that sort of city planning, town planning. It doesn't do any good to run a highway out one way if your neighboring town is running a highway out another way. And making that shift, because we have a lot of people that are driving toward immediate answers for a single leadership question, and giving people breathing room to think about that. If we combine our efforts and we think larger, we're answering the question in a more nuanced way. So, agility, and it's a scale issue, but on both sides, we are scaled at a point where we can turn and say, we need to do this quickly. I always honor smaller schools or less well resource schools and the things they've done for sort of data governance, because when UNC School of Medicine decides to do something, we can put a lot of energy to bear on it. So that's one way of being nimble. But what we aren't immediately nimble at is being able, I think, like Christy will talk about, to answer complex questions. It still takes quite a lift, and that's really where we're trying to grow that capacity. But we're all answering questions now that we couldn't have imagined having to answer 10 years ago. And that takes both being nimble, being well governed, but also being there's a trust. And I think that's something that Christy speaks really well of that sort of overarching institutional trust and everyone buying into that vision. And so those are all hallmarks of maturity. But I think, we're getting there to answer the bigger questions more easily. We answer them, we just don't do it always as elegantly as we could. And that's where we're going.
Jill, can I ask you a follow-up question around, so you're a School of Medicine. So for those on the call who are also with schools of medicine, your data is much more unique than possibly the rest of the institution. So can you talk about just a little bit about the relationship that you may or may not have with campus around their data governance efforts and how it interplays and is distinct?
So when I came here almost 3 years ago now, one of my goals was to build up a sort of larger data warehouse model, and looking at what we could do. And we actually partnered with our clinical partners and our university partners. So on our steering committee for our project was our chief data officer for the UNC Health, as well as one of the woman who leads the data efforts at the university. And that was really key, because we don't want to remake the wheel. We want to use their authoritative data sources, add attributes and nuance as it comes closer and closer to our specific mission, and realize that flowing the data back to our partners is key. So having that alignment is absolutely vital. And that goes to that the depth of the sort of question you need to answer with data. So we can answer questions with large data, which is what we're currently doing, because we're partnering with our clinical and our university partners. But getting that more and more well-honed answer in the complexity of triple threat faculty, when you're dealing with multitudes of grants, different educational settings, and complex clinical data, is really where we're focusing. But we do partner exceptionally close, and we follow their data governance on both sides.
That's great. Thank you. Christy.
So, Jill is correct. We do have a very strong maturity. We're somewhere between proactive and optimized. But we also acknowledge that we're still growing too, right? So, being mature enables us to be able to respond to that change with intention instead of that urgency. And I think that's something that we didn't have in the very beginning. This has been an effort that's been going on for 8 years, and I've only been part of it for the last 5. So, being able to have someone ask us a question and us being able to be able to respond, or be able to say, oh, we've already done that, right? And here's that answer for you, has just been pretty awesome to see as we've been working with faculty and their needs starting to come out, and us being able to say, hey, we've already cultivated some products for you from this data that we have. We do have a very strong data management and governance structure, and that helps us to shift to that strategic, it helps us to improve our services as well as our productivity. And our leaders do trust our data, but it wasn't that way in the beginning, right? So in the very beginning, it was a little bit of chaos, and we're talking 8 years ago, so it took time, and it's not something that does happen overnight. It is a huge collaboration between our data governance, our subcommittee, and all of the senior leaders of the campus as well. We are able to evaluate any of the requests and the challenges that come in, and we're able to do that now with more consistency and clarity than we were used to. But again, we're still growing. So that means that we need to, or we can pace our implementations. We can phase policies thoughtfully. We can focus on building even more trust throughout the community itself and through our data. So it's maturity for us is, it's not like perfection, although sometimes I wish I could be perfect in this. It's more being able to adapt, to be able to ask some good questions. And we need to make sure that we're involving the right voices, especially as this landscape continues to shift. And we're using data literacy to help us do that.
For both of you, I'm curious, you talked about your data maturity and where you're at. And I thought of this just as you were talking. I was thinking of the quote of the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. And you mentioned you started, Christy, 8 years ago. Jill, you said that you're answering questions that 10 years ago you might not have thought you would need to be answering. Some of that means you've got the data and you've kind of maybe got the ability to do it. Any thoughts from each of you? Like if people feel like they're behind, where would you start? I mean, it's on this journey, or quickly try to speed things up. Because while we've talked about answering questions for the last few months, and it's going to continue. It's not going to end. I think this is going to continue to evolve pretty quickly.
I think it's all dependent on what type of institution that you are, because I really don't think it's anything that can be rushed. No matter how much we want to be in that maturity that Hamilton is, it took us 8 years. It took a data warehouse. It took collaboration between every single department. It took the ability to find the right people. When I talked about the analogy earlier about the dining hall, every single one of those stations has a chef, right, that's making all of those meals. And that's what we would consider our data stewards. But behind that are all the other people, maybe the head chef and the kitchen managers and all of those people that are working behind the scenes that we don't normally see. Without all of that, it's really, really hard to be able to set down policies and procedures and to even find out what do we need, where do we need to go. If I guess if I could have started from the beginning, I always go back to the joint analytics statement that was prepared with the three entities, EDUCAUSE, and forgive me, my mind just went blank, but that actually has some amazing, amazing resources that helps you kind of judge where you're at and where you need to begin. If we were just beginning this journey, I would have definitely gone straight there. But when I came into the institution, we already had the data warehouse, we already had the subcommittee, we were already well into 200 and something definitions. I think now we're almost approaching 350. So now what we're doing is we're just shoring everything up. We're maximizing what we have, and we're also creating more equity and inclusiveness around our data itself to make sure that it can be used by pretty much everyone in the community when necessary.
Thank you, Christy. I just going to say, I just posted what I think was the joint analytics statement you were talking about. It was an EDUCAUSE, AIR, and
Yeah,
Kubo collaboration. Go
great,
ahead,
great
Jill.
resource.
So where to start? So yes, we are answering questions that we wouldn't have known we were going to have to answer 10 years ago. We are building the sort of enterprise data infrastructure and ethos to do that more quickly and nimbly and without having to convene committees around the questions. I happen to come from an institution that had a 25-year sort of repository for data. And that was driven by a single visionary dean in the late 90s, which was quite remarkable. And also not the and centralized resources that weren't flooded out. So I think this is really how to get to where you need to go is a scale, a size, and a leadership question, I would think. many institutions have what I call a proper noun governance structure, which is it's small enough. You know who you can trust, you know who you can't trust, you know who's allowed to say something and who's not allowed to say something. And in some cases, what prevents a place like that from succeeding at governance is sort of institutional dysfunction. They probably couldn't even frame a question. So I think if you have that trust and that knowledge, then investing in the sort of structure and using that sort of framework can be done relatively quickly because you can get people at the table. Larger scale institutions, and I would certainly say UNC School of Medicine, and we're talking about, we have about almost 8,000, between faculty, staff, and students, almost 9,000 now. It's big, and the whole institutions that we touch are big. So it's harder to do that sort of proper noun management. So you have to have that, you have to have leadership that buys in, but you have to have a ground game of getting people to understand that their work isn't being devalued. Their work is, the value of their work is actually growing because it's going to grow with other people's data, with other people's reporting, and it's going to paint a bigger, clearer, and more functional picture. And that's the sort of evangelical work that I think we all have to do. No amount of governance, no amount of data literacy, no amount of data definitions changes the fact that at the end of the day, somebody has to stand up and say, not only do we need to do this, that here's a pathway and we can do it. We can, and it's important, and we will. And that, I think, is that institutional will is hugely important. And if you can't get everyone to agree that this does matter, no amount of formalized governance or literacy is going to really change that.
Yeah. And so I have a counterpoint question for you. No, so we think about when we're starting from scratch, which is a great question. When we think about what do we do first? How do we approach this? So for those institutions that are really early, we often think about, all right, let's get a program charter. Let's get some executive sponsors. Let's work on roles and responsibilities. And yes, those are important. But to your point, Jill, change management and communication. What if we're working with individuals who would be our stewards or who would be our custodians who don't actually understand that much about data, or don't understand the value, or don't understand that security is important, yes, but in terms of an offensive strategy and how we use our data with predictive and advanced analytics, that we can thread the needle and we can make that balance really well. And so how would you see using data literacy to almost be the precursor sometimes for your work? Because if you come in and say, all right, we have to do this, we have to do it, we in change management, we also have to think about the hearts and the minds, and you can do the stick and give the penalties for not doing what someone's supposed to do, but we'd rather use the carrot. We'd rather win the hearts and minds to get them to buy in and do the right thing with data, to have ethics around data. And so I'd love to hear how you see data literacy being important at this time.
So I think one of the most amazing things about working in academia is that we work with incredibly smart people. Every day in and day out, we all get to interact with some of the smartest people in the world. And that's, I think, keeping that in mind. I think of our faculty and our staff too as being exceptionally data savvy. These are people, we have people who've written papers to advanced statistical techniques. These are not people that are data illiterate. But the sort of business data literacy does not follow naturally. And I think this is where the conversation has to fall, that it's not that we question your ability to use the data and you have access to through little g governance, or data you've generated, or data that you have an IRB to use. What we're talking about is that sort of data at scale and operationalizing in a way. It's a very corporate model in some ways of what we're trying to do. And that's sometimes the word corporate is really rough in our environments because we have a lot of autonomy, and that's one of the things that makes our where people can ask great questions and think differently about what we do. So part of this is getting them to shift from a sort of internally focused view of how data is concerned and think of it as a collective thing. And I think so the data literacy and data ethics are that at scale and not questioning them personally and having them understand what the conversations and the rules need to be. It goes back to that, city planning. I'm not going to do a bad thing on my property. And I think my neighbor's not going to, but I don't trust a person 6 streets away because I don't know them. So this is a model of saying, what are our general rules of civility and engagement around this? And you don't necessarily know what the data is that somebody else has and how they approach it. And so it's leveling the playing field and really driving that cultural conversation and change management.
Mm-hmm. Christy.
So I want to go back to my analogy again. I was just telling a department this a couple of weeks ago. I think of data literacy as a data literate diner doesn't just go into the campus dining hall and just start grabbing anything and putting it on their plate, right? They're checking what's in it. They're looking at portion size. They're choosing what they need based on that, right? So they're giving feedback if something was mislabeled or not working. So, if you think about data literate person, data literate data user, there's somebody that is looking at this chart first. They're not just saying, yep, that's it, that's the answer, and walking away. They're wanting to question, where did it come from? How can they use this as evidence to support their decisions? And do they even have the tools and that insight to see what it even shows? Do they even understand what they can take from this information? Right. So, we use data literacy to help our community understand how to use the data. But also, why does it matter, right? Like Jill was saying, we want them to understand where the data comes from, and we want them to be able to apply it meaningfully in their work, whether that's in the classroom, if that's student support, if it's leadership. So we're making that data more approachable through building that culture where data is not just protected, but it's understood, it's trusted, and it's used to drive the mission forward. Even as our environment constantly is changing, we think that data literacy is more like a shared language. So not just the technical tools, but it's essential if we're going to be able to navigate evolving policies, definitions, as well as any of the cultural shifts that are currently happening. But as a skill, data literacy also allows our data users to really understand what they're seeing, to translate that into the actionable insights. And then as we require definitions to change, we're also looking at how can they collect the data, use the data, and then communicate that back to ensure clarity and consistency within. So, my thing has always been, if we don't have data literacy, then we risk confusion as well as having just unsupported decisions. I feel that, I came from a corporate environment where you would look at things and be like, you know what, that just feels good. I think we should do this. This just feels right. We cannot do that any longer. We must have evidence to support the decisions that we make. And I think that data literacy helps us to move through that process.
Thank you.
Thank you both. I was going to post it. I just say it right here. Remember to post any questions you might have, excuse me, in the chat. So as you're talking about what's happening today, what's near term for each of you? And then what I mean by that is, the next few months, the next couple of years, what do you have teed up as your next steps? And where are you headed? And I realize some of that might have just pivoted in the last few months as you're looking forward.
So at Hamilton, we are working on creating really solid program training so that our data stewards have everything that they need in our incoming new stewards, because as someone is assigned by our trustee as a steward, they might not know what they need to be doing. I believe that all of our stewards already know their data, right? They are the subject matter experts. So we are just focusing on how can we help and support them as a data steward. We're also creating training for data literacy that will be starting within our departments and then moving out to the entire campus. And then I'm working on communication. I'm trying to come up with ways to share information and to share data governance. We use a very non-invasive practices that Robert Signer has created, and I feel that it's more of how can we show you how data governance matters without using all of these strict policies and rules and stuff about you have to do this, you have to do. We don't want that kind of culture. We want a culture that says, hey, here is this wonderful asset. How can you use that asset to create the evidence that you or to not create, sorry, to find the evidence that you need to support that decision that you're making, right? So we're looking at newsletters. We're looking at highlighting, efforts that are going on in our data governance community, but just basically continuing that effort of fostering a culture of informed decision making is my goal over the next year.
Mhm. We are in a real change period. We are moving to much more centralization of our data, driving the business practices of that sort of mission-based questions, and looking at driving into the nuance. So I think we're at the point where we're building plans for growing that data literacy and the data ethics as a common language. Not to say that we haven't had that, but to say that we haven't had a common language of that. Starting to build up constructs of, who owns the data narrative for the institution, for the missions, for the departments, because again, just because you can make a PowerPoint out of data does not mean you should be making a PowerPoint out of data. And you certainly presenting that PowerPoint with the data is not. So these are sort of fundamental shifts because our world is really complex right now, and how we talk about what we do and our students and our research faculty and our clinical enterprise, is really talking about the future of our institution and the future of health in this country and in North Carolina. And we are using that as an opportunity now to say, how do we scale up in a logical and culturally respectful way.
I have a follow-up question. In thinking about, the next 2 years or the near term, oftentimes we'll see measures of maturity. One of those being that you've incorporated roles and responsibilities of stewards, trustees, and custodians into those job descriptions for the roles of those individuals who would serve as those data governance roles. I'm curious, have you thought about that? Will you consider that? Or is that a piece that is outside of non-invasive data governance, Christy?
It's not actually outside of it. Actually, Robert Signer talks about that a lot because it's more of making sure that we are recognizing the work that our data stewards are doing, but it is not a topic that has been discussed at all at our institution at this point. Right now, I think we're focused on making sure that we're also right in the middle of an ERP changeover to Workday. Unfortunately, that takes about 99% of all of our resources and leaves us very limited in what we can and cannot do at this time. But it probably will be a topic of discussion in the future.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're looking more at embedding good data I don't want to say stewardship, good data practice and good data ethics within most job descriptions. So thinking about it as a widespread and kind of our common ground around data, that making sure that we include everyone, because I think many times that we think about the sort of top down, the steward is the person at a place as large as ours. There is a big distance between someone at a mission level stewardship and somebody who may be making a PowerPoint for a chair or something. And part of this is kind of both ground games. We have to think about who is a steward and how we approach that. And that will be very role based, but that sort of individual position description is going to be much more important to say, we hold these values and this is how they're represented.
That's great.
Thank you both. I'm just thinking as you were talking, we, as a firm, I've been doing this for 3 years since I left higher ed and just work entirely with higher ed now, and so talk to a lot of different institutions. And we find it's fairly disparate. You get organizations that talk a lot, Christy, as you talk about your maturity and what you've done there in a fairly centralized approach. Jill, where you've got it's a little more difficult, right? It's more decentralized, a little harder to manage and herd cats, if you will. One of the things that people still struggle with, and you hear, and kind of, we've been working at this for 15, 20 years in our data environments, is kind of that single source of the truth. And we'll hear that. So can we trust that source of the truth? And in these days, that gets to be even more important because deans and other departments and other areas might want to show up with their version of that, whatever that happens to be, if it's enrollment numbers or something else. My question for each of you, and I didn't know this question was coming, but where do you feel like you're at on that? Are you there? Do you have that source? And if people out there are struggling with that, and we hear that a lot as we do work with folks and help them with data governance, what steps would you advise to try to get there or get closer to there?
Christy?
So I do believe that we have the single source of truth, right? But we didn't years ago. And it is because of everything that we've done, right? So um, what we have is the policies and the procedures, but we also have the governance, right? The governance that says that this is the definition, and that definition goes into the data catalog that says this is the definition of enrollment. This is the definition of, enrollment on campus for enrollment off campus, right? Because we do have that struggle before where they were like, no, I know what the enrollment number is. No, you don't. This is what the enrollment, right? Because there were so many of them. Having the data warehouse, having that be where the data comes in, where it is transformed, where it is cleaned up, and then from there, that is what is used to create all of our dashboards, our self-service analytics, any requests for data that it comes from there. But attaching that to that data definition, attaching that to the process that, you cannot create a dashboard unless the data is governed. That's the term that we use when we're training. There's a difference between governed and ungoverned. Ungoverned data has gone through the entire process and has been deemed as ready to use, whereas there are data out there that is not gone through this process and therefore it is ungoverned. So for us, that is how we created that single source of truth, backed by all of the people that are working on that data that, we can solidify and say, yes, this is the source, right? But that involves our data stewards, our trustees, it involves our data users, it involves institutional research, it involves the entire campus community, because we are creating that culture and fostering that responsibility. And I feel that that is all pertinent to getting that single source of truth as well.
Mm-hmm. The single source of truth is really hard. For example, for a brief period in the spring, we have no second year students. We have a 4-year curriculum, but we have no second year students. And that's because we have 3 levels to our curriculum, our med school curriculum, and they advance partway before they end their second year. So when you say we want to talk about a med student cohort, or if somebody says, how many second year med students do we have? For about a 2.5-month period, maybe a 3-month period, the answer is
0.
So when you have things like that, so suddenly you have to say, are we talking matriculating class? Are we talking graduating class? Are we talking by level? Are we talking by academic year? Are we talking by, it's an incredibly complex thing. When we talk about it, our clinical partner says, they are a faculty member. They have gone through they're a credentialed faculty physician. Well, are they a full professor, an associate professor, an assistant professor? Are they on a renewing appointment? Are they on a 1-year appointment? Are they adjunct faculty? Are they volunteer faculty? So when you are bringing large organizations together, and so we try to go back to the people. A person has attributes. Who owns the attachment of attributes rather than systems of truth? What we try to have are sort of mission-based purview regarding metadata attributes and those sort of recipe books of truth, if you will. So Systems of truth, part of why academic medicine is so complex is we have multiple large-scale systems of truth, and we spend a lot of our time parsing attributes to align with the various business models. So I think the concept of a system of truth is hard to scale because everyone points to a different one. I think when you start talking about a system of trust, you can get a little further. This is trusted data. This is trusted data concatenated with other trusted data. This is two types of trusted data that are the attributes are added by trusted mission areas. It's not easy.
I mean, I'll plus one, Jill, my time in a school of medicine, trying to understand faculty and putting clinical and research data together with faculty was quite challenging because of all the different ways to define a faculty member. But I wanted to ask, we've talked about policies and procedures, and I'm curious, do either one of you, have you created data governance policies? And if you have or have not, what was the rationale for that?
Christy?
So what do you mean in data governance policies?
A data governance policy, period, an official.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, actually, it's in the process of, okay.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
so yes, we actually have several policies that are in the process of that we're working on right at this moment, which basically outlines, things like your data roles and responsibilities, like who are your data stewards, who are your data trustees, what is a data custodian, right? What is the data steward, and what are the responsibilities? And I think that's extremely important because we want our data users to know that they have a responsibility when they're using this data. They may not be the one that understands the data specifically in terms of subject matter. They may not be the ones that work in the IT office. Maybe they're just the ones that are needing the data to inform their decisions, but they still have a responsibility to the data. So we have those policies, and those policies are then tied to security, to the making sure that the data is safe, making sure that the data is not being just sent over to people who aren't supposed to have the data, right? Making sure that it's in front of the right users and so forth. But yeah, I think that policy is set to go through approval this year and hopefully be posted to the campus community.
Well, so this is one of the times I don't feel feel so bad compared to Christie's ecosystem. We are in the process of building that. We are going through, we did a multi-year analysis of where we stand with educational and administrative data. We are moving toward a large-scale data literacy engagement. And from that, we'll grow the sort of the formal governance policies. We currently have we've inculcated a strong governance practice. It is still kind of almost frighteningly on a proper noun basis right now of who has to sign off on things. But for the first time ever, we are starting to have a way of saying yes, but try not to say no, but sometimes we do. There is a framework to say that's not an appropriate use of data. Let's work with you to see where we can go. So we're growing it, but it's going to be, I think we're going to be a little bit further behind Hamilton.
We do have a question in the chat, and it says, Nathan says, seems to me that a central issue is using data and/or evidence to support a decision as opposed to having decisions arise from the data evidence. Maybe the idea of a single source of truth is tied up in this. Has anyone worked with or have an approach to this that was successful?
I could speak to my previous institution. So I came from the University of Vermont Larner College of Medicine. And I think that's a really astute observation. To some extent, I think really great when you get to a fully data realized environment, people stop talking about systems. You really never want a department chair to talk about PeopleSoft. I mean, do any of us really ever want to talk about PeopleSoft? But when you get to that, you start having a conversation that talks about the questions we're asking of the data. So I think that again, it goes back to trust, it goes back to culture, it goes back to that sort of emergent quality where we have data and we think about data as a tool and not as a thing. So it's not about what came out of PeopleSoft, Susie Cream Cheese's, name is spelled wrong. It's really about that larger scale. So I think that's a really astute observation.
I don't think that we've actually approached this in any other manner except just to make sure that the data, making sure that we know where the data is, where is it coming from, and then how are we going to use it, right? That single source of truth is more of, we know that our trustees and our data stewards, as well as our senior leadership, know where the data is coming from in terms of what's on their dashboards, right? They don't have to be concerned with, what is the lineage. They can ask and we'll give that to them, right? But they already know that the people that are working with this data are making sure that where the data is coming from initially, such as maybe PeopleSoft or Slate or whatever, and coming into the warehouse, that process is refined, it is accurate, and it's producing that correct data point based on the definition, right? So I think in Hamilton, we don't bring in data until we have a definition to begin with, right? So if somebody's coming to us and saying that, oh, well, we need to understand this goal in our office. So then it's the responsibility of myself or ORIR to say, okay, well, what data do you need to answer that question, right? So what are the ways that we can measure and track this goal that you have? Then at that point, if the data that is necessary to answer that question isn't even available, then it has to be created in a sense, right? So now we need the data point. So is the data point available? Is it in one of our systems? Maybe it's necessary to send out a survey, and that's how we'll get that data point. Maybe it's a combination of using a data point from here and a data point from here that creates this, calculation that does this, right? Once that's determined and that definition is created, then at that point, that person in the background is going in and saying, okay, now I know where I'm going, what I'm doing. I'm going to go in here, I'm going to get that, and I'm going to bring it in, and I'm going to make sure that it's accurate. So I think that I do agree 100% that it is, we are using data only as evidence to support, right? To be able to say that I am making this decision for this institution based on evidence. And here's all the data that I'm using to as evidence.
So you both talked about data, and you were just talking, Christy, and I was thinking about that back to the single source of the truth. And of course, part of that is that data, what's the quality look like? And how have either of you had success implementing workflows or different processes to try to make sure either clean up or ensure that you've got the right kind of quality in your data?
I think that we have a lot of workflows and processes within the data governance process. That quality is all part of that as well. Going in, looking at what is all the metadata to begin with, right? What is this data point? How many options are available? Because you could have a single data point, but that data point may also have multiple things. So gender, right? We have more than one option under gender. We have race, we have more than one option. Making sure that we understand every single piece of that metadata is how that data quality is assured in success. I don't know that we actually have like a specific workflow because every system works differently and we're pulling from so many, right? We're pulling from Workday, we're pulling from Slate, we're pulling from Presence, we're pulling from 25 Live, and that's just a couple of the systems that are on our campus. But we're also pulling from APIs. We're also pulling from survey data that has been ingested into the warehouse. So there's just so many ways. So there isn't like one specific way, but we do have processes in making sure that the data coming from the system, starting at the definition, going all the way to being governed or trusted, has a specific process and workflow of persons that must sign off on that.
Mm-hmm. So where we're starting, so I've talked a lot about scale and scale at UNC, is to some extent, we're also looking at the flip side of that, which is we are generating data for will soon to be 230 medical students. So if we're taking just something like a singular exam grade, that doesn't necessarily have the power that we need to actually talk about student achievement. We are looking at exam questions. We are looking at log file data about changing answers. We need vastly more data points for everything each of our students does if we're looking at really precision medical education. So again, harkening back to what I did at the University of Vermont and things that we're starting to implement here, it's looking at very consistent rules around the micro data that, this what would be traditionally data discards in many other data environments. And so kind of working from that side to ensure that we have a really solid ground game on log file data and rules around log file data, rules around sort of data, pathways through systems and that sort of thing that people look at it for odd reasons. So I think that we're having a lot of success at that level while we're driving the conversation at the other level.
Thank you. Thank you both. Jason, I see you coming back in. We are coming up on the hour. Both Jill and Christy, any final thoughts, any one sentence word of advice if somebody was looking as they're really trying to improve their data literacy and their data programs on their campus?
I
I'll
would
put you
say
on the spot.
I would say it's trust.
Yeah.
Start talking about what it takes to trust someone else's data, using someone else's data, and what would it take for you to trust giving your data to someone. That's a really on the ground conversation you can have.
I agree, trust, but also collaboration, right? I can promise you, in my 5 years, it doesn't work if you don't have collaboration. You really need to be working with everyone, and if you're not able to do that, it's really going to make it a very difficult process.
Great. Well, thank you both, Susan and I, and Vantage. Really appreciate you joining in on the panel and putting your efforts towards this. We had a great conversation about data and the effectiveness across our campuses. If anybody's listening needs help with their data or data governance, Vantage is always here. A resource you can reach out to us, even if you just want to ping some questions around or talk about different things that we've done at different institutions to assist. So again, thank you very much, Jason. I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you all. Just a couple of things to note before jumping out of the room. We really do thank you all for your participation and also your feedback. So if you can provide some feedback at the form link there for Alchemer, we have a survey there. We share that with our presenters so that they can see your feedback as well as the EDUCAUSE team. We will have the recording posted on the event page, the registration page for this webinar shortly, within hopefully a couple hours. And we also want to draw your attention to part 4 of this 4-part web series, which will actually be a little bit of a time from now, but on September 15th at 2 p.m. is the final portion of the series with Vantage, and it'll be on aligning IT and enrollment goals and priorities. So please click on that registration page right there and register now. We'll see you all at the next event, and we really appreciate it. Thanks for the great discussion. Have a good day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.